All right, welcome back, folks. Now, this is our final lesson for Reconstruction. Um, and we're going to start off talking about secret societies. Okay, there were some secret societies that were formed during this time, um, and largely in response to uh, the the new legislation that's being passed and the legislative climate of the country at the time with the passage of the three Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. 13th being the abolishment of slavery. Okay, the 14th Amendment being the Citizenship um, Amendment, which also extended citizenship to African Americans. Anyone born or naturalized in the U.S. is a citizen. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, which granted or extended the right to vote to all males. Okay, anyone who's a citizen can now vote, and it doesn't say males. Okay, it says anyone who is a citizen can now vote. Okay, um, so which includes African Americans. So you have these secret societies that formed during this time, and their primary means of getting their point across, and getting across what they wanted to get across, is through the use of terrorism. In 1866, a group of former Confederate soldiers of Pulaski, Tennessee, formed a secret society named the Ku Klux Klan after the Greek word klukos, meaning circle, which means an inclusive or an exclusive groups, a group that excludes others. Okay, only those who are in are privy to the group's plans. Okay, dressed in masks and robes to symbolize the dead Confederate soldiers who returned from the dead in search of the enemies of the South. Their goal: to keep out foreigners outside of their circle. They opposed unions. They supported prohibition. Now, prohibition, which we're going to find out a little bit later on as it continues to gain steam, is prohibiting the sale, production, and commercial use of alcohol. Okay, they felt threatened by changes in American society, especially with regards to the inclusion of former slaves in society. In 1868, Ku Klux Klan murdered 1,000 people just from Louisiana alone. Okay, remember, it's gonna in 1870, Louisiana is going to gain a black governor. 1867, the Ku Klux Klan elected Nathan Bedford Forrest as its leader. Now, he was a former Confederate general, and we mentioned him when we looked at the generals of the Confederates. Nathan Bedford Forrest was one of them. One of the primary means of terrorism that they used in order, again, to get their point across was lynching, through lynching. What is it? It's a premeditated, extrajudicial killing by a group. Okay? So when we look at these words and we look at the roots and we look at the prefixes and suffixes and we break them down to define the words so we know what we're talking about, premeditated means that it is something that is planned beforehand. Okay, it's not just a crime of passion. Somebody's upset and they react and then they kill somebody. Okay, it's not like that. This is something that they planned out beforehand. Pre meaning before. Okay, meditated meaning to think upon. Okay, so something that is thought upon before the act occurs. Extrajudicial. Okay, judicial meaning to judge, to make a judgment on. Okay, and there are courts of law that are supposed to be the judges. Okay, they're supposed to judge the merits of someone's innocence. Okay, extra meaning outside of. Okay, so these are pre-planned judgments rendered by outside forces. Okay, and it is a killing usually by a mob. They go in, they grab someone, they know who they're going to grab, they grab that person, they take them and they kill them. Okay, that's lynching. That's what lynching is. And primarily, this is how they did it. So why was it done? It was used as a scare tactic. Okay, now, not just the person who's lynched. The person who's lynched, they're dead. They're not scared anymore. They're dead. Okay? But the other people who see the lynching occur are now terrified. And they would do this. They would do these lynchings in voting lines when there were people who were standing in line to vote. Blacks who were standing in line to vote. Former slaves standing in line to vote. This mob comes up, grabs one person out of the line, and takes them and kills them. How many people are going to be willing to stand in line and vote after that? And that's why they did it, was to dissuade people from voting, especially blacks and former slaves, discouraging them from voting. This created the existence of a racist environment, and it was allowed by a permissive government. We talked about the permissive government of the South that was kind of allowed to flourish under Johnson's presidency. Okay, 1870 to 1950, 5,000 people were killed, with 70% of them being black through the process of lynching. 1870, 23 people every 2.5 days were killed. Most concentrated in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas. What do those states have in common? That's correct. They're a part of the South, the former Confederacy. So, but these lynchings weren't just restricted to the South. Zachariah Walker in 1911 was lynched in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. So, that also happened in the North. Folks, there's racism everywhere. Okay, it happens. People are racist. There are people who are racist in all parts of the world. Every country in the world has its subgroup of racist. Okay, it's not just limited to the southern United States. It's not just limited to the United States. It's all over the world. Okay, so government responds to the lynching violence and the violence of these secret societies with the Force Acts. A series of 4 acts passed by Republican Reconstruction supporters May 31st, 1870 to 1875. These Force Acts were intended to protect the constitutional rights guaranteed to blacks by the 14th and 15th Amendments. So the Enforcement Act of 1870, one of the 4 Force Acts, is the Enforcement Act. It says it banned the use of terror, force, or bribery to prevent people from voting because of their race. So remember those voting lines where these secret societies would come up and lynch people out of line and kill them? Yeah, well, when you station the U.S. government soldiers at voting precincts, you're probably not going to have as many mob enacted lynchings happen, okay? Because the people in the mob also don't want to get shot by the soldiers who are there protecting the voting precincts. So the purpose of the Enforcement Act is protected blacks' right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and receive equal protection of laws. How? Declare martial law, impose heavy penalties against terrorist groups, use military force to suppress the KKK. And that's what happened. Okay. Enforcement acts to stop the secret societies. Number one, federal supervision of elections. Make sure that these elections, these voting precincts, are protected by the military. Number two, president to declare martial law in areas of the Klan. Now, this is Grant who declares martial law in areas of the Klan. The Freedmen's Bureau dies out and the Klan dies out eventually because the Enforcement Acts help to control all of that. But then the Amnesty Act. Those were who were Confederates before. You're getting to the point where you're almost a decade from the end of the Civil War. So nearing the 10-year mark following the Civil War. And now it's time to forgive. That's what amnesty means, remember, to forgive those who were a part of the Confederacy. Redemption begins. Okay? So then we have the election of 1876. So Grant is elected president over Johnson in 1868. Grant is then reelected in 1872. And so after he's served his 2 terms, it's time for him to step down. And now we have 2 newbies coming in. Okay, Hayes and Tilden, 1876. There was a dispute over 4 states. The Democrats scared away Republican voters. This was in the South. These were these secret societies scaring away the people who would vote Republican, okay, through lynching tactics. Republicans, on the other hand, threw away Democrat votes. Just said, you're going to scare us away? We're going to rip yours up and throw them away. Okay? Hayes wins the electoral vote. And as we've talked before, whoever wins the electoral vote is the president. So Hayes should be the president. Tilden won the popular vote. This has happened before a number of times. This happened very recently. So here you go. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes gets 165 uncontested. This is where there was no contention. There was nothing disputed. Okay, these are the votes that he won. He gets 165 of them, electoral votes. Tilden gets 184 uncontested electoral votes. So that case, just leave it there. You just leave it there. That means that Tilden should win. But then you have 4 states where there are disputed votes. And if you tally them up, these states are Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina, and 1 vote in Oregon. Okay, because Oregon is one of those split electorates. Okay, so that's 8, 9, 13, and 20 electoral votes. When you add those two, they were all for Hayes. Okay, when you add those to Hayes' 165, he now has 185. He wins by 1 electoral vote. But the popular vote is won by Tilden, 51% to 48%. Okay. Yeah, Peter Cooper, he didn't really matter. Okay. He didn't do much of anything. But still. So, because there was dispute with those 20 votes, they've got to decide what's going to happen here. Like, how are we going? This is going to be a highly contested and disputed presidency. What's going to happen? Is this the end of the government? Like, what is going to happen here? And it's considered the fraud of the century. That's the stolen election of 1876. All right? Where they compromised. Hayes could remain in office if, and here you got the Compromise of 1877, the North, or also known as the North-South Compromise. Hayes could remain in office. He would get those 20 disputed electoral votes. if the North will pull federal troops out of the South, Confederate generals will be given a seat in his cabinet, or a general, support federal aid for economic and railroad development in the South, and allow Southerners to handle race relations themselves. You can see how this might be a bit of a problem. Okay, if Southerners are allowed to handle race relations themselves, you've seen how they were going to handle it before. Okay, so here we're getting rid of the military districts in the South. Confederate general who was not supposed to have any place in government is now going to have a seat in Hayes's cabinet, not in these cabinets, but in his advisors. Okay, support federal aid for economic and railroad development in the South. Support appropriations for building levees along the Mississippi River and give huge subsidies to railroad. And mark the end of Reconstruction. That's what this Compromise of 1877 did. It supported these appropriations for building levees along the Mississippi River, and it marked the end of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction period comes to an end now. And this gives Democrats control of Southern politics once again. And we're going to see some things crop up, like Jim Crow laws, which are very similar to the Black Codes. And this is why. It's part of the Compromise of 1877. So just a quick overview to rehash before we close out this lesson. Your Reconstruction plans, Lincoln's plan and Johnson's plan. Here are some of the similarities, or these are the differences of each. The similarities offered pardons to Southerners who swore allegiance, and states could hold elections and rejoin the Union. Many people question whether or not Reconstruction was a success or a failure. What were the successes? What were the failures? Okay, think about them on your own. Do you think Reconstruction was more of a success or a failure? Well, think about it. Think about what happened during Reconstruction. At the end of Reconstruction, Southern Democrats now have control of race relations in the South. More restrictive laws on blacks are going to come out of that with the Jim Crow laws. So in that case, it's a failure. Okay, but when you look at the amendments that were passed during Reconstruction, with the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendments, you have the end of slavery as an institution in the United States. You have blacks and former slaves getting the right to vote and also gaining citizenship in the United States. Those are huge successes, really big successes. Okay, you have the country kind of coming back together. You look at some of those elections. A great portion of the South voted Grant into office as the president. So you have a lot of successes, and probably more successes than failures. Yes, you have some failures. You had over 600 blacks and former slaves being elected into office. In 1860, that would have been unheard of. It happened 10 years later. 10 years later, that happened. It's just completely unheard of, but it happened. It's amazing. So 2 goals of Reconstruction: unifying the North and the South, and equality for freedmen. Both of them happened. Okay, especially this first one. The second one, there's some slack off on that one a little bit later. So there's some contention whether that one actually happened. But yeah, for the most part, those 2 goals of Reconstruction were achieved. Reconstruction fades away. Republican Rutherford beat Hayes. This is still a review. Runs against Tilden. Tilden received majority of popular votes. 20 disputed votes were there, but were then given to Hayes so that he could win the presidency by 1. and they had some things that changed as a result. The Democrats gave up the election in exchange for basically Southern power and a lot of other things, a lot of other concessions. So that's the end of that lesson. The next lesson that we'll cover is a changing society, where we'll kind of pick up where we left off, even backtrack just a little bit, and we'll cover up until the early 20th century, and that will actually be for the next two sections. We'll cover from Reconstruction until 1920 before we get into World War I. All right, thanks for listening.